This is Hidden Killers with Tony Bruschi.
DNA doesn't lie. But people misunderstand it all the time. And with the new DNA evidence that is coming out in the Bryan Kohberger case, we are going to try and break this down for you so you can get a better grasp on what is going on. From the touch DNA on the knife sheath to the new revelation about 3 different people's DNA being under the fingernails of one of the victims. Let's go back to DNA before we jump into the case. It is the gold standard of forensic evidence. The microscopic smoking gun. That's either the key to conviction or the ticket to freedom. But here's the thing. DNA is only as good as its interpretation. And interpretation is where things get messy. In the case of Bryan Kohberger, the man accused of murdering 4 University of Idaho students, forensic DNA evidence has played a pivotal role. A single source match on a knife sheath found at the crime scene, that's solid. But DNA from 3 different people under one victim's fingernails? That's kind of a forensic nightmare. It's the difference, at least in this case, between a fingerprint on a gun and a smudge on a doorknob. One test, it tells a fairly clear story. The other, not so much. And yet both pieces are present in this case. So how does this all work? What exactly does it mean when someone is included in a DNA mixture, but not definitively matched? And more importantly, why does all of this matter? Let's break it down. How forensic DNA profiling works. Let's go through that. At its core, forensic DNA testing is like a high-tech game of matching patterns. Every person has a unique genetic blueprint, like a barcode, made up of short tandem repeats, STRs. These are sections of DNA where certain sequences repeat, and the way they repeat is what makes each person's DNA distinct. Think of STRs like a song stuck on repeat. For one person, the chorus plays 4 times. For another, it's 6. When forensic scientists analyze DNA, they look at 13 to 20 specific locations of loci on a person's genome where these repeats occur. If every single location matches, you have a match that's about as unique as a fingerprint. If they don't match, the person is excluded, plain and simple. This is why single-source DNA samples like the one from the knife sheath in the Kohberger case are so strong. It's one profile, one person. You can't find anybody else with it because it doesn't exist. That test either confirms or excludes. It's very black and white. But when multiple people's DNA is in one sample, as was the case now with the DNA found under Madison Mogen's fingernails, things get complicated fast. Now, instead of a clean fingerprint, you've got a smudged handprint, and forensic scientists have to figure out which fingers belong to whom. The challenge of mixed DNA samples, that's a big one. The DNA mixture is exactly what it sounds like. Multiple people's genetic material overlapping in a single sample. It's not uncommon in crimes involving close contact. Blood, sweat, skin cells, any of these can mix during an attack. And if a victim fights back, their fingernails become tiny crime scene capsules. But here's the problem. Once you have more than one person's DNA in a sample, it's no longer a simple yes or no test. Instead, scientists are now working with probabilities. How likely is it that a particular person's DNA is in the mix? The more people involved, the harder it is to untangle. Imagine a crime scene where 2 people leave their footprints in the mud. If one set of prints is deep and clear, you can probably match it to a shoe. But if 2 or 3 people have stepped all over the same spot, now you got a mess of overlapping patterns. And suddenly it's not so easy to say whose footprint belongs to whom. That's exactly what happens when forensic DNA mixtures occur. If one person's DNA is dominant in the sample, it's easier to pull out a clearer profile. But if everyone left only a small amount, the signals overlap. And now you just got a genetic jigsaw puzzle with missing pieces. And if this is where probability enters the picture, it's going to get interesting. We have inclusion now versus exclusion. This is an important thing to note in the DNA that was found under Madison's fingernails. What the numbers actually mean in this case is if someone is excluded from a DNA sample, it means there's a clear mismatch. Their DNA doesn't fit. And they're off the list. It's just not going to be part of this mixture. If you put a cheeseburger and a banana and an orange into a blender, you could scientifically break that down and identify, kind of what it's made out of. And you could determine that watermelon wasn't one of the things in that blender. But if you broke it down and went, okay, there's cheeseburger here, there's other items. I forgot what else I threw in that blender, but let's assume I remember. And you could identify exactly what they are. Or at least, pretty close to. If someone is included, that doesn't mean they definitely contributed to the sample. It just means their DNA could be in the mix. This is where statistical likelihood comes in. For example, if mixed DNA sample contains markers that have the population might also have, that's not exactly compelling. But if the odds of a random person having those markers is like 1 in 10 million, that's a very different story. This is why forensic scientists don't just say, it's a match. Instead, they use likelihood ratios, a statistical way of measuring how much more likely a DNA sample belongs to a suspect versus a random person. Think of it like this. If you find a pair of sunglasses at a crime scene, you might say these could belong to the suspect. But if those sunglasses have the suspect's prescription, initials, and a custom frame, only sold to 5 people in the country, well, now you're working with serious odds. With mixed DNA, the likelihood ratio tells us whether a suspect's DNA is strongly supported as being in the mix, or if their inclusion is so weak that it might as well be anyone. And in the case of Bryan Kohberger, the DNA found under the victim's fingernails did not exclude him, but it didn't solidly include him either. It's the forensic equivalent of a murky security camera image, enough to keep him in the frame. Kind of looks like him, but it's just so grainy. It's not enough to convict him on his own. This is why the defense is fighting to exclude the DNA evidence from the trial and why this prosecution still wants it on the record. Because when it comes to mixed DNA, it's all about how you frame the argument. Now, there's a reason this matters beyond just the Kohberger case. Mixed DNA evidence has been used to both convict and exonerate people, sometimes incorrectly as well. Cases have unraveled because DNA that was once used as damning evidence turned out to be a meaningless noise in a messy sample. So as we move forward, we have to ask, how reliable is this kind of DNA in high-stakes murder trial cases like this one? And more importantly, how do we separate forensic fact from forensic fiction when a case like this goes to court? Because if DNA is the gold standard of forensic science, we need to talk about what happens when that standard gets put under the microscope. The DNA evidence in the case against Bryan Kohberger is a tale of 2 very different scientific conclusions. One piece, the DNA found on the knife sheath, button. It's the kind of evidence prosecutors dream of, a clean, single-source match that places Kohberger's genetic material at the scene. There is no arguing that. That's what it does. The other, the 3-person DNA mixture found under Madison Mogen's fingernails, is a forensic puzzle, a mixture of very tangled DNA that even experts can't agree on exactly what it means. And that disagreement, that right there, is where things get interesting. When forensic investigators processed evidence from the crime scene, they found what you'd expect in a violent attack: blood, skin cells, biological material, and multiple people. It's not surprising that the victim's DNA was everywhere in the house that they lived in. What stood out, though, was that forensic scientists found when they tested the fingernail clippings taken from Madison Mogen, one of the 4 students killed that night, mixed with her own DNA, were the genetic markers of 2 unidentified individuals. Let's be clear. If this were a different kind of case, say a mugging, where a victim scratched the attacker and their DNA was found under the nails, that would be incredibly strong evidence. But this isn't a mugging. And the DNA mixture found under Mogen's nails isn't the smoking gun prosecution might have hoped for. And here's why. The forensic lab wasn't able to separate out those 2 unknown DNA profiles cleanly enough to say who they belonged to. That means despite all the advancements in forensic DNA technology, this particular sample was what experts call inconclusive. And inconclusive DNA evidence is a defense attorney's dream. From a forensic standpoint, this 3-person mixture is messy, which means analysts couldn't look at it and say with confidence, this belongs to Bryan Kohberger. But they also couldn't rule him out. That left them in this kind of gray area that neither side in the case is particularly thrilled about. The prosecution wants evidence that places Kohberger at the scene, and the sample doesn't do that definitively. The defense wants something that excludes him completely, and this sample doesn't do that either. So what does it exactly mean to be not excluded? That's where the statistics come into play, where scientists analyze the DNA mixture like this. They use something called a likelihood ratio, a mathematical way of determining whether it's more likely that the DNA in the sample does not belong to a suspect. A high likelihood ratio means the suspect is strongly supported as a contributor. A low likelihood ratio means it's likely someone else. In this case, the likelihood ratio for Kohberger wasn't strong enough to say, yes, this is definitely his DNA, but it also wasn't low enough to say, this definitely is not him. It sat right in the middle, in forensic limbo, which is exactly where the defense wants it to be. And if you ask Kohberger's lawyers, they will tell you this forensic limbo should work in their favor. They've claimed that their own independent DNA experts has ruled Kohberger out completely. That despite the state's findings, Kohberger's genetic markers are not in this sample at all. The details of their independent testing haven't been made public yet, so, With this argument that they're making, the fingernail DNA is unreliable, and they want it thrown out before trial. And that's a fight that could have major consequences, because if that 3-person DNA mixture isn't Kohberger's, if it belongs to 2 unknown males, that opens up a whole new big question in this case. Who do those DNA profiles belong to? And this is where the defense starts to play offense. They argue that the real significance of the DNA mixture isn't that it's inconclusive for Kohberger, it's that it proves the presence of someone else, someone whose DNA was found on the body of one of the victims, someone who, as far as we know, hasn't been identified. And this isn't the only unidentified DNA in this case. Investigators also found an unknown male's DNA on a glove outside the house and on a railing inside the home. That means at least one other person's genetic material was found at the scene. And if the defense has its way, they're going to hammer this point home. Could this unknown DNA belong to someone who had completely just been innocent and for an innocent reason had it in that house? I mean, it's a party house. It does seem fairly likely. Of course, DNA evidence doesn't tell us how or when genetic material was left behind. It just tells us it's there. But in the case where the defense is arguing reasonable doubt, this could be a big deal. The prosecution, of course, is going to argue that this is all a distraction. They have what they see as far stronger DNA evidence, evidence that does link Kohberger to the crime scene directly, in a way that's far more conclusive than the fingernail sample. That evidence is the knife sheath. When investigators found a leather sheath from a K-bar knife at the scene, They swabbed the button strap, the kind of place where someone would naturally leave touch DNA. It's hard to open a K-bar knife strap. You got to use some force, and you're definitely going to get touch DNA on it if you're using your fingers. And when they tested that sample, they found a single male DNA profile. Not a mixture, not an inconclusive sample, a single source match. That's the kind of DNA evidence that doesn't need a statistic to explain itself. And when investigators couldn't find a match for it in any law enforcement databases, they turned to something newer, investigative genetic genealogy. They took the DNA from the sheath and ran it through public ancestry databases, looking for partial matches, relatives, distant family members, anything that could point to the suspect. And it did. The genealogy search led them to a family tree that pointed straight to the Kohberger family. Once Kohberger was identified as a possible suspect, police needed to confirm the match. They retrieved DNA from the trash at his parents' house in Pennsylvania and ran the test again. The result, a statistical likelihood so high that excluding him would be nearly impossible, basically because there aren't enough other people on Earth that it could belong to. That's why the prosecution is focusing on the knife sheath DNA as its strongest forensic evidence. Unlike the fingernail mixture, this one doesn't leave room for interpretation. It's not an inclusion, it's a match. But the question remains, how did that knife sheath get left behind? Because here's where things take an unexpected turn. If Kohberger really was as careful as some of the other evidence suggests, turning off his phone before arriving at the scene, moving in and out quickly, why would he leave behind something as personal as a knife sheath? It's an inconsistency, and it's one the defense will likely seize on. Because as strong as this DNA evidence is, if it's going to stand up in court, the prosecution is going to have to answer an even bigger question. If Kohberger left his DNA behind, what else did he leave behind that proves he was there? And that's where we start looking beyond just the DNA. Because in a case like this, forensic science alone is not enough. It's time to talk about what DNA cannot tell us. DNA, it's powerful, but it's also one of the most misunderstood forms of evidence in the courtroom. Jurors hear DNA and they think it means a certainty, a lock, a match, a fact written in stone. But forensic science isn't that simple, and neither is the legal system that tries to interpret it. The biggest problem? It's false certainty. When a forensic analyst testifies that a suspect cannot be excluded from a DNA sample, the average juror hears something completely different. They hear, it's him. They think DNA evidence is as straightforward as a fingerprint, something that either belongs to a suspect or doesn't. But as we've seen, mixed DNA samples don't work that way. Being included in a mixture isn't the same as being identified. And if jurors don't understand that distinction, a weak piece of DNA evidence can sound a lot stronger than it actually is. And this kind of misunderstanding has put innocent people behind bars. In North Carolina, a man was convicted after forensic analysis testified that his DNA could not be excluded from a mixture found at a crime scene. Sounds damning until you look closer. The reality? The DNA sample was so degraded and so mixed that it could have included thousands of people in the local population. But once that phrase "could not be excluded" was spoken in court, the damage was done. The jury assumed it meant a match, and the suspect was convicted. Years later, DNA experts revisited the case using updated forensic software. The result? Well, the original findings were wrong. The suspect should have been excluded from the mixture all along, but the limitations of early forensic methods made that impossible to see at the time. He spent years in prison before finally being exonerated. This is exactly the kind of misinterpretation of forensic science that Kohberger's defense is trying to prevent. They're arguing that the DNA under Madison Mogen's fingernails is unreliable, that it's a complex mixture that can't be trusted, that if jurors hear "cannot be excluded," they'll assume it means guilty. And they're not wrong to worry about that. This is why they filed a motion to have the fingernail DNA thrown out entirely. They don't want it admitted into evidence because they know even an inconclusive forensic test can sound conclusive in front of a jury. The prosecution, of course, is pushing back hard. They're arguing that even if the fingernail DNA is not perfect, it still matters, that it supports other evidence in the case, that the jury should hear about it and decide for themselves. This brings up an even bigger question. How much weight should DNA evidence carry in a case with no eyewitnesses? Forensic scientists have been warning about this for years. DNA is an incredibly useful investigative tool, but it was never meant to be the sole piece of evidence in a case. It was meant to support other evidence, eyewitness testimony, surveillance footage, physical evidence. When a case leans too heavily on DNA, mistakes can happen. We've seen it before. One of the most infamous examples of DNA evidence gone wrong was the Amanda Knox case. In 2007, Knox and her boyfriend were convicted of murdering Knox's roommate, Meredith Kircher, in Italy. The prosecution's star evidence? A tiny trace of Knox DNA on the handle of a kitchen knife and a microscopic amount of Kircher's DNA on the blade. It sounded bad. But here's what forensic experts later pointed out. The amount of DNA on the knife blade was so small that it was barely detectable. The tests that found it wasn't even part of standard forensic procedures. It was a highly sensitive test that could have detected contamination from the forensic lab itself. Later, when a team of independent experts reviewed the evidence, they found that the knife blade had been improperly stored and handled, meaning the tiny amount of DNA found on it could have gotten there through accidental transfer. Despite this, Knox and her boyfriend were convicted, largely based on this one piece of forensic evidence. It took years of appeals and re-examining of the DNA finger and findings before the case was overturned and Knox was eventually freed. The lesson? Trace DNA isn't always proof of guilt. Then there's the O.J. Simpson case. Back in 1995, DNA evidence was still a relatively new concept in criminal trials. Prosecutors presented forensic evidence linking Simpson's blood to the crime scene and the victim's blood to his car and home. Scientifically, this was strong evidence, but the defense attacked the handling of the DNA. They argued that the sloppy police work had led to potential contamination, that investigators had collected some samples improperly, and that the possibility of cross-contamination cast doubt on the reliability of the DNA findings. And it worked. The jury wasn't convinced, and Simpson was acquitted. These cases show just how critical forensic integrity is in a trial. If DNA is mishandled, misunderstood, or misinterpreted, it can lead to the wrong outcome, whether that's a wrongful conviction or a wrongful acquittal. And then there's other sides of the coin, cases where DNA evidence has helped put the right person behind bars. The Kevin Foley case is a prime example. In 2006, Dr. John Jelinek was murdered in his Pennsylvania home. He had deep defensive wounds on his hands, and forensic investigators swabbed beneath his fingernails. The DNA analysis pointed to one person, Kevin Foley, a Pennsylvania state trooper who had been in a long-running dispute with Jelinek. Unlike the mixed DNA in the Kohberger case, this wasn't some complicated, inconclusive sample. It was clear, a direct match, like you have on the knife sheath. Foley was convicted, and to this day, the DNA under Jelinek's fingers remains one of the strongest pieces of evidence against him. This is the kind of forensic evidence that holds up in court. Direct, single-source matches that leave little room for interpretation. Which brings us back to Bryan Kohberger. The debate over the fingernail DNA is just one part of a much larger conversation about the role of forensic science in criminal trials. As DNA technology evolves, so do the ethical and legal questions that come with it, which have been asked many, many times in this case and argued. Take investigative genetic genealogy, IgG, the method police use to track Kohberger through his family's DNA. It's an incredible tool, but it's also raising serious privacy concerns for some. Should law enforcement have access to public ancestry databases without a warrant? Should people who upload their DNA for family search and research automatically be entered into criminal investigations? And then there's Probe ballistic genotyping, the advanced software that forensic labs now use to interpret mixed DNA samples. It's supposed to help make forensic analysis more accurate, but critics argue that it's a black box, an algorithm that defense attorneys can't fully scrutinize. And when the stakes are this high, when a person's life hangs in the balance quite literally, should any forensic method be trusted without full transparency? These are the questions forensic science is grappling with right now. Because DNA isn't just a tool for solving crimes, it's a tool that can make or break a case. And as we've seen time and time again, how that tool is used can mean the difference between justice and disaster. And in the case of Bryan Kohberger, one question remains. Will the DNA evidence be enough? What do you think? Let us know in the comments on YouTube if you're watching us there. Be sure to press subscribe as well and hit the bell so you don't miss any notifications about our daily updates. And if you're listening on the podcast, press subscribe wherever you are downloading so you don't miss any of our updates. We do greatly appreciate that support. I'm Tony Bruschi. Thanks for listening.
The latest true crime stories, expert breakdowns, and shocking twists, all in one place. Press subscribe now to the Hidden Killers podcast and True Crime Today.